I've been hiking for about 2 hours now, and I still haven't seen another soul. The trail was pretty busy when I started out, but everyone had stopped at the river to take a break. And since I had a bit of a lead, I decided to push on a little further. I don't mind being alone, but I do get a bit jumpy sometimes, so it's always comforting to know that there are other people around. And then suddenly, just as I rounded a bend in the path, I saw her. She was standing behind a cluster of trees, and although she wasn't directly blocking the trail, she was clearly standing there on purpose. At first, I thought she must have been here for a while because there was a thin layer of dirt on her clothes, which meant that she'd probably been sitting down at some point. But there were no signs of a camp or even a bedroll. Also, the sun was shining through the leaves above her, so she hadn't been hiding in the trees for very long. She didn't move, though, not even to acknowledge me as I passed by. And she wasn't making any noise, which was weird because usually when you're out in the woods, there's always some kind of noise, birds, squirrels, maybe the wind rustling through the trees. But there was nothing. It was completely silent except for the sound of my own breathing. I tried to catch another glimpse of her as I walked past, but she was completely still. Was she even real? Maybe I'd been walking for too long and I was starting to hallucinate. I stopped and turned around to go back, but as I did, I realized that I couldn't see her anymore. I walked back until I came to the cluster of trees and parted them to reveal a narrow path leading deeper into the woods. I stood there for a moment, listening intently. There was still no sound, and when I looked back, I couldn't see the path. I walked in a circle, but I couldn't find the spot again, and after a while, I just shrugged and carried on. It was only a few minutes later when I heard a twig snap, and I froze. She was following me. I slowly turned around, and there she was, just as I had seen her before, only this time she was closer, and I could see that she was barefoot. Her feet were a strange color, almost translucent, like an old piece of fish left out in the sun too long. And I noticed that she wasn't wearing a hat or sunglasses. But what really caught my attention was her face. She had very wide eyes that seemed to be staring right through me. They were the color of amber, and they didn't blink. After a moment, she turned and disappeared into the trees, and I stood there for a while, not knowing what to do. Finally, I decided to follow her. I quickly made up the distance, and soon enough, I saw her again. She was still standing motionless, but now I could hear the sound of water, and I realized that she was standing at the edge of a stream. And if she was real, then the ground beneath her should be wet, but it wasn't. There was no sign that she'd ever stepped foot in the water. And then I knew that I had to get out of there. I turned and ran as fast as I could, crashing through the trees, desperate to put as much distance between us as possible. Every now and then, I'd glance over my shoulder, but I never saw her again. I don't know how long I walked for, but eventually the trees began to thin, and I found myself back on the main trail. When I finally reached the car park, my hands were shaking and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I got in my car and locked the doors. Then I called the police and told them about the woman in the trees. They were very nice, but they basically said that there was nothing that they could do. They told me to call if I needed help finding my way out of the woods, but they couldn't send anyone out to search for a missing person because I hadn't actually seen her. She might have been a real person, or she might have been a hallucination. All I knew was that I never wanted to set foot in those woods again. Welcome to Camp Whisper. This is a scary story from a Reddit user. I've been to this camp before. It was amazing. I couldn't wait to go back. It was on an island in the middle of a lake surrounded by nothing but trees. There were a few other families staying there that week, but we didn't see much of them. We got our own cabin with bunk beds and a big fireplace and spent most of our time swimming off the dock or just relaxing. The place was great. One thing I remember was how quiet it was at night. I mean, it was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. That is, of course, except for one night. Around 2 a.m., my sister and I were awoken in our top bunk by what sounded like whispers coming from outside the cabin. My dad must have been awakened too, because he got out of bed and went to investigate. Now, here's where the story takes a turn. According to my mom and sister, my dad came back into the cabin a few minutes later looking shaken. He told us to stay in bed and not make a sound. Then he left again, this time grabbing a flashlight and a baseball bat. He told us to stay in bed and to not come out until morning. So my sister and I just lay there in the pitch-black room listening to what was outside. All we heard were whispers. At first, it sounded like they were coming from all around us, but then it seemed like they were coming from the tree line outside the cabin. We could hear what sounded like hushed voices talking, but we couldn't make out any words. Then suddenly, the voices seemed to come closer. It sounded like they were right outside the cabin now, moving closer to our door. My sister and I started to scream and cry, but my dad must have put some sort of spell on us because we couldn't make a sound. All we could do was watch our bedroom door in the pitch-black room as those whispers got closer and closer. Then, of course, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. My dad came back into the room, his face pale in the moonlight that streamed through the window. He got into bed without saying a word and held us close until morning. Now, obviously, we asked him what was out there and why he was protecting us, but he just said he didn't know and that we should probably get some sleep. Well, after that morning, my dad never really wanted to talk about that night again, and my sister and I never asked again. Fast forward a few years, and I decided to go back to that cabin with a group of friends. I was excited to show them the place where I used to spend such great summers. However, when we got there, we found out that the cabin had apparently burned down years ago, and no one had been there since. None of us had ever heard of the Whispering Pines before. It wasn't until I was going through some old photo albums that I came across this picture. In this picture, you can see me standing on the dock with two other boys from the neighborhood. I don't remember this day very well, but I do remember something. I remember that day because that was the last day I saw my friend Billy before he vanished. The three of us stayed up late that night watching horror movies and telling ghost stories around a campfire. When we went to bed, I remember Billy saying he didn't want to sleep in the cabin with the rest of the guys. He said he wanted to be alone. I thought it was weird, but whatever, and I went to sleep. In the morning, when we went to go check on Billy, he was gone. His sleeping bag was unzipped and there was a small hole in it. It was almost like he crawled out of it. But the thing is, none of us had ever seen that hole before. I remember searching for him for hours, calling his name until we couldn't call anymore. I remember sitting on that dock, kicking my feet into the water, thinking about how I would never see my best friend again. That night, the counselors told all of us campers the same story. They said that around 2 a.m., some of the cabins catch fire and the campers mysteriously disappear. They say that sometimes you can still hear their whispers in the wind. So the next day, when I was packing up to go home, I asked the counselors if I could take something from the cabin. I took a tape recorder that I knew Billy had brought with him that last night. I figured it was worth a shot. Maybe we'd find something. When I got home, I played the tape for my parents and friends. All we heard was the crackling of the fire and crickets chirping. But then, as the tape ended, we heard a single word. It was barely audible, but it was enough for us to hear. The word was run. Welcome back, everybody. I'm here with the worst-case scenario for you today. This one comes from a Reddit user. He says, a few years ago, a missing person was reported in our area. The guy had been hiking in a provincial park about 2 hours away from where I live. His name was Kyle, and he was a father of 2. We'll call him that. He had texted his wife and kids telling them that he was lost, but that he never left the trail. His phone pinged from deep off map, so search and rescue were able to triangulate his position, and that's when things got weird. They found his phone nailed to a tree with what appeared to be a makeshift antenna attached to it. It was still sending out texts on a 10-minute delay saying, "I never left the trail," over and over again. His body was found 2 days later at the bottom of a ravine. Apparently, he'd managed to send those texts while on the trail, but then he fell. He was dead on impact, and the phone automatically sent the location data to emergency services. So maybe we can take some comfort in that part of the story, that he didn't suffer for long and someone would find him eventually. But yeah, pretty creepy that his phone was still sending out distress signals even after he was dead. Yeah, this is one of those stories where the technology is doing something that it wasn't necessarily intended for. Like, that's what makes this story interesting, is that typically, you don't expect your phone to still be sending messages after you die. Typically, once you run out of battery or you turn your phone off, like that's it, right? Your phone stops functioning until you recharge it or restart it. But in this particular case, it sounds like the phone was not only on airplane mode, which is why it was picking up no signal out there in the wilderness, but it was also just programmed to keep sending this message every 10 minutes, which is something that you would normally associate with like a clock or a scheduled message, right? You go on Facebook and you hit schedule and then you put it to send in 10 minutes. That's what it sounds like this phone was doing. So how did that happen? Did he program that on his phone before he went on the hike? I don't know. But this is one of those stories that if we had more information, it might be less interesting. Like, it's kind of fun to imagine that this phone was possessed or something like that, right? If you read ghost stories, sometimes ghosts will possess electronics and then start sending out messages to people or like turn their lights on and off, stuff like that. But the fact that this is probably a very rational explanation makes it a lot less interesting. But at the same time, I think it does make it a little bit more plausible that he was actually trying to get help from his phone. And unfortunately, he was not successful in that endeavor, but at least his phone tried. Do you have a strange cell phone story? Maybe you were camping in the middle of nowhere and all of a sudden you got a text message from somebody you didn't know, or you made a call and then the line stayed open and you could hear voices in the background. Do you have any of those stories? I would love to hear them. Just put them in the comments. Also, Do you have a scary story that you would like me to read? Put it in the comments and cite the source. And also, if you like the podcast, please subscribe. Those little things really help us out. We're almost at 300,000 subscribers, which is absolutely insane. And that is all I have to say. Thank you for listening, and as always, don't forget, the eyes in the back of your head are watching you. A man is lying in the snow in a clearing, but when rescuers come to his aid, they discover something strange. There's no sign of a cabin that the man had told them about. What could have happened? Let's find out in today's episode. It was winter in Canada, and a terrible blizzard was raging outside. The wind was howling and the snow was piling up when a lone traveler named Ben found himself lost in the woods. It had been 2 days since he'd gone for a hike, and he still had no idea where he was. But then, through the blowing snow, he saw something in the distance. As he got closer, it became more clear. It was a small log cabin. Ben had never seen it before, but he was so desperate for shelter that he didn't hesitate. He just ran towards it and burst through the door, slamming it open. Inside, there was a small fire burning merrily in the hearth, and a large pot of stew was bubbling away on the stove. It was just what Ben needed. He warmed himself by the fire, ate some of the stew, and then went to sleep. And when he woke up, the storm had passed and the sun was shining. But he still had no idea where he was, or how to get out of the woods. So he did the only thing he could. He set off into the trees to find help. He walked for hours, but the forest seemed endless. Just when he thought he might never be found, he came across a road, and soon after that, a friendly couple driving by offered him a ride. They brought him to a local restaurant where he called the authorities and told them everything that had happened. He described the cabin in detail, and the officers took down all of his information. Then they said they'd send a search party right away to find this mysterious cabin and rescue any other people who might be trapped inside. But when the search party arrived at the spot where Ben had told them the cabin was, they found no trace of it. All they found was Ben lying in the clearing, asleep in the snow. And when they woke him up and asked him where the cabin was, he insisted that it was right there. But they looked around and saw nothing but trees. Ben was taken back to the restaurant where the police interviewed him again. They asked him if he was sure that he hadn't made the whole story up, but he insisted that he wasn't. He told them that he'd been lost in the woods for days and that he had stumbled upon a cabin that was filled with food and supplies. He had stayed there willingly, but when he left, the search party should have had no trouble finding it. The police were skeptical, but they didn't want to take any chances. So they brought Ben back to the clearing to see if he could lead them to the cabin. But much to their astonishment, he couldn't. It was as if the cabin had never been there at all. In the end, Ben was charged with disorderly conduct and resisting arrest for wasting the time of the emergency services. As the last charge was dropped, he was let off with a warning. And while he may have gotten away with his story, the same can't be said for the cabin. Someone had obviously placed it there with the hopes that someone would stumble upon it and call for help. But whoever did this was never found, nor was anyone ever found to have built the cabin in the first place. Some believe it was a hoax, and that Ben had made up the whole thing. After all, why would a cabin appear out of nowhere? Who would do such a thing? But others believe that the cabin was real and that there's a more logical explanation. You see, the area that Ben had gotten lost in was well known for its optical illusions. Because of the way the light hit the trees, it was easy to become disoriented. And according to some, a similar cabin had appeared years ago, only to disappear again just as quickly. What do you think happened to Ben? And where do you think the cabin went? Let me know your theories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like it for more amazing stories. Thanks for watching. Sometimes people go missing and are never found. Sometimes people go missing and are found safe and sound. And sometimes people go missing and turn up in places they'd never even seen before, claiming to remember nothing at all about how they got there. In this week's episode, we're looking at the strange case of a man who woke up in a clearing with no memory of how he got there, only to realize that the very spot he woke up on had been empty just days before. On the morning of November 26, 2013, 49-year-old Patrick Wall was reported missing by his wife. The day before, he'd gone out hunting and hadn't come home that night. His truck was found abandoned along the side of Forest Road 215 near the town of Grand Marais in Minnesota's Arrowhead region, which is known for its dense forests and hundreds of lakes. But there was no sign of Patrick anywhere. A search party consisting of family, friends, and local volunteers spent 2 days combing the area for any sign of the missing hunter. As night fell on the second day, the group's hope began to dwindle. With no sign of Patrick or any indication as to what might have happened to him, the decision was made to call off the search for the evening. Meanwhile, A local resident who'd heard about the missing person put out some trail cameras that he uses for hunting. He put them up in the same area where Patrick's truck had been found, hoping to catch a glimpse of the missing man. When the resident checked the cameras a few days later, he noticed something astonishing. In the footage was a log cabin that hadn't been there when he set up the cameras. Not only that, but someone appeared to be tending a fire inside it. It looked like it could have been used for shelter. The resident immediately called the police. An investigation was launched. Police tracked tire tracks from the road to the spot where Patrick's truck was found, but they didn't see any signs of a cabin. They did, however, notice that someone had recently dug up a large section of snow, so they brought in an investigator with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. He brought a cadaver dog along, and the dog began sniffing around the area where the snow had been disturbed. Soon enough, the dog picked up Patrick's scent. The investigator followed the scent to a small depression in the ground, at which point the dog began barking furiously. Despite the ground being covered in snow, Patrick's body was nowhere to be seen. The investigator decided to remove the snow, revealing a shallow depression in the ground, the imprint of a person lying face down. But still, there was no sign of Patrick. So they brought in heavy machinery to remove the rest of the snow. What they found was a set of human footprints leading away from the depression, but these footprints were inconsistent with Patrick's size 14 work boots. Whoever had made them was also wearing snowshoes. And Patrick doesn't know how to snowshoe, nor does he own a pair. The footprints led the authorities to another set of tire tracks. These tracks matched the size and depth of Patrick's truck. Authorities had hit a wall. They searched the surrounding area for a cabin, but couldn't find anything. Even stranger, no one in the area reported seeing or hearing anything unusual, nor did anyone know of any cabins in the area that might have been used for shelter. Was this really a case of a missing man who'd been found and then lost again? Or was there some other explanation? The only evidence they had to go on was the cabin in the trail camera footage. But without a physical structure to analyze, it was impossible to say for sure if the cabin was real or if Patrick had somehow hallucinated it. It wasn't until nearly 2 months later that the mystery was solved. Patrick's brother-in-law was going through the footage frame by frame, hoping to spot something the police had missed. Then he noticed something strange in the reflection of the window. It was a camera. The camera that Patrick had been holding the whole time. This meant that the entire time Patrick had been missing, he'd actually been in the cabin. But how did he get there? And how did he get from the cabin to the clearing where his truck was found? Unfortunately, there's no easy answer. No one knows exactly what happened to Patrick Wall. He may have gotten lost and stumbled upon the cabin, or he may have purposely gone there with the intention of hiding from search parties. Whatever the reason, his body has still not been recovered, and the cabin in the footage has still never been found. What do you think happened? Let me know your thoughts. As always, thanks for watching. If you like this video, be sure to check out another one just like it. And don't forget to subscribe. The year is 2018. The location is Zion National Park, Utah. 3 park rangers. 3. That's all that was needed to ensure the safety of the hundreds of thousands of tourists that visit this park every single year. It's their job to keep the park clean and safe, often having to kick people out for trespassing or, just being a nuisance. But sometimes they come across something a little more sinister. And that's what happened here. It all started with a routine sweep of the park for the annual Great American Cleanup Day. The 3 park rangers, 72-year-old Samuel, 52-year-old Eric Storm, and 29-year-old Mary Jane, all met up at the Hurricane Utah Visitor Center, got their supplies, and headed out into the park to do their sweep. They split up into 2 teams. Eric and Mary Jane would head down the Riverside Walk, while Samuel took the more remote and rarely traveled Canyon Overlook Trail. All in all, it was just a regular day at the office. That was until it wasn't. After about 2 hours of silence over their radios, Samuel reported back to the visitor center. His shift was over, and he had found nothing of interest on his route. He even mentioned how clear the trail was and how no one should be there at the time. Eric and Mary Jane were still out on their route, so Samuel decided to head back to the visitor center early to get some work done. Meanwhile, Eric and Mary Jane were about 2 miles down the Riverside Walk when they heard a noise that made them stop in their tracks. It was a noise that neither of them recognized. They looked at each other and decided to investigate. They followed the sound to a small alcove where they found a pile of what looked like wet leaves. As they got closer, they realized that it wasn't leaves at all, but thousands upon thousands of little pebbles that were arranged in an almost perfect circular pattern. And right in the middle of it all was a radio. Eric and Mary Jane looked at each other again. They knew those radios were supposed to be off since they were on a remote frequency that only emergency services in the park could access. Yet the radio was on and transmitting faint static. Before either of them could say anything, though, the radio crackled to life, and a voice, one that neither of them recognized, came out of it. "We see something. It's not human," the voice said before the transmission cut out again. Eric and Mary Jane looked around frantically, trying to figure out where the voice came from, but there was nothing there. No one. They decided to call it in to the visitor center and waited for a response, but none came. They tried hailing Samuel on the radio, but all they received was static in response. Concerned that something might be wrong, Eric and Mary Jane decided to make their way back to the visitor center to check in. When they arrived, they found Samuel sitting at his desk with a worried expression on his face. He explained that he had tried calling them multiple times, but the line was dead. The three of them decided to head out to where Eric and Mary Jane had found the radio, but they never made it. Their car was later found abandoned near the spot where the Rangers' radios were discovered, but none of them were ever seen again. A massive search effort was launched, but it turned up nothing, and after a few weeks it was called off. To this day, no one knows what happened to those three Rangers. Some believe that they may have stumbled upon something they weren't supposed to, like an illegal archaeological dig or maybe even some sort of government experiment gone wrong. Others believe that they may have been taken by something more sinister, like an animal or even a person. But that's just a theory, a crazy theory. Thanks for watching. If you want to see another scary story, click right here. A hunter was tracking a deer through the woods. It was late in the day, and he hadn't had any luck. As the sun began to set, he saw his opportunity. A nice 8-point buck was standing over a clearing, and the hunter took aim and fired. But he missed. The bullet didn't hit the deer, but instead struck a nearby birch tree. The hunter walked over to the tree and looked at the spot where the bullet had hit. At first, he thought it was just a regular old hole in the tree. But then he noticed something strange. Red liquid began to ooze out of the hole. The hunter was confused. He had never seen anything like this before. He reached out and touched the red liquid. It was warm and wet, and that's when he realized what it was. It was blood. The bullet had hit the tree so hard that it had opened up a vein. The hunter felt bad for the animal. He didn't mean to hurt it. But it was getting dark and he needed to get home before nightfall. So he left the woods without telling anyone about the bleeding tree. The next day, the hunter went back to the woods. He was hoping to find the deer and finish the job. But when he got to the tree, he couldn't believe what he saw. The trees had moved. The forest had shifted overnight, and now the hunter was lost. He tried to stay calm, but he was starting to panic. He had no idea where he was or how to get out of the woods. Then he heard a noise. It was a twig snapping. The hunter froze. What was out there? Was it an animal? Was it a human? Was it something else? The hunter was scared, but he knew he couldn't stay frozen in place forever. He had to do something. He took a deep breath and tried to calm himself down. He told himself that it was probably just a deer or a squirrel. But the sound came again, and this time it was closer. The hunter started to run. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he had to get away from the sound. He could hear it getting closer and closer, and he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. Then he tripped and fell to the ground. As he lay there, catching his breath, he heard a voice. "Don't be afraid," the voice said. "I'm not going to hurt you." The hunter looked up and saw a man standing over him. "Who are you?" the hunter asked. "What are you doing here?" The man smiled. "I'm here to help you," he said. "You're injured. Let me take you home." The hunter hesitated, but he knew he had no other choice. He let the man help him up, and they walked out of the woods together. The hunter was scared, but he was also relieved. He had never seen anything like this before, and he didn't want to see it again. When they got to the edge of the woods, the man turned to the hunter and smiled. "Thanks for the venison," he said. "I haven't had a good meal in days." The hunter's eyes widened in horror. He understood now what had happened. The man had lured him into the woods, then injured him so that he would bleed. He had used the hunter's own blood to attract animals to the tree, and then he had fed on them. The hunter screamed and ran as fast as he could. He didn't dare look back to see if the man was following him. He ran until he got to his car, then drove as fast as he could to the hospital. At the hospital, the doctors were able to clean out the wound in his leg and stop the bleeding. But the hunter knew that he would never forget what had happened to him. He would never forget the feeling of being hunted, the terror of being stalked by a predator, or the horror of realizing that he had been used as bait. Welcome to my channel. Today's video is called You Were Never Alone. It's a scary camping story from a solo camper. He was going through his drone footage and saw something that just didn't belong there following him around camp. He said that it was out of frame every time he turned around, but it always stayed behind him. So he decided to go back to that spot to see if he could find whatever it was. While he was walking around, he continued filming with his drone, and he zoomed in to try to get a better look at whatever was in the footage. But when he did, it had no face. It was just black. It looked like a person, but it just didn't have a face. So then he posted the video to Reddit to see if anybody else could see what he saw. People thought it was either a bear or a mountain lion, but those animals usually make a lot more noise than this, and there was no noise in the video at all. Some people thought that it could be a person with a ski mask on, but he said that he lives 30 minutes away from the nearest city, and this was the middle of nowhere. Plus, if it was a person, why wouldn't they run up to him? He goes on to say that he wasn't scared while it was happening, but he definitely was after seeing the video. He said that he's never going camping again. Now, I don't believe that for a second. This guy is never going camping again because of this video. There's no way. So then he responded to some of the comments, and some people asked if he could post the whole video, so he did. Here's the longer video. I watched the whole thing, and it's really not that scary. It's just kind of strange. I mean, it does look like there's something back there behind him. Like, it doesn't look like it's a very clear day and there's nothing really casting a shadow like that. You know, it almost looks like there's a person back there. But then again, we do see the whole video now, and it's just kind of strange. It's not really anything crazy. Now, I've seen similar videos to this before where it looks like there's something behind them, and then when they turn around, there's nothing there. But I think this is one of the first ones that I've seen where they actually show you the longer video. And it's interesting because you can see here in the longer video, it definitely looks like there's something there, especially when he zooms in. If you look right here, there's definitely something there. That's for sure. It looks like a person, but it just doesn't have a face. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I would be scared if I saw this in real life. I would definitely be scared. But I've seen enough videos like this now, where it turns out to be something else that I don't want to jump to the conclusion that it's a person without a face or a ghost or anything like that. In this video, there's definitely something there. I don't know what it is. Could be a bear, could be a mountain lion, could be a person, but I do think that this is one of the more convincing videos that I've seen. I think that most of these videos are probably fake. I think people just run up behind the camera person and then they turn around and they are just out of frame. This one, though, it does seem like it's following him around and it's out of frame every time he turns around. And the fact that it has no face kind of adds to the creepiness of it. But I don't know. What do you guys think? Let me know down below. Also, if you enjoy these kinds of videos, please stay tuned because I have a ton more of them. I try to make videos like these every single day. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you next time. Bye. Campers are some of the most secluded and isolated accommodations you can book. You're out in nature, surrounded by trees, away from the rest of civilization. It's supposed to be relaxing, getting back to nature, unplugging from the outside world. But sometimes the outside world has a way of intruding upon your secluded getaway. Something big is out there, something that howls. A group of friends had rented out a cabin for the weekend. They were going to enjoy some much-needed downtime away from the stresses of everyday life. As they arrived at the cabin, they noticed something strange. There were no windows or glass doors, just a heavy wooden door with a big old-fashioned latch. They all shrugged and went inside. They had barely settled in when they heard a blood-curdling scream in the forest. All four of them jumped, nearly knocking over a table between them. "What was that?" one of them asked, his voice shaking. Nobody had an answer, but they all agreed it sounded like someone in pain. Another scream echoed through the trees, and they all huddled closer together, trying to calm their nerves. Maybe it was just some wild animal, a bear or a mountain lion. They were deep in the woods, after all. Then they heard footsteps, heavy footsteps that seemed to be getting closer. They all stared at the door, listening intently. Was that animal still out there? Was it injured? Was it coming closer to the cabin? Then they heard what sounded like hail for a few seconds, followed by heavy thuds. The commotion outside the cabin slowly came to a halt, and they all let out a breath they didn't realize they'd been holding. Suddenly, one of them spoke up. "I'm gonna go check it out," he said, grabbing a flashlight. The others protested, telling him it was probably just an animal, but he was already gone. They heard the old wooden door creak open, and he stepped outside with his flashlight, scanning the ground and the trees. "It's clear," he called back to them, his voice shaking slightly. "Whatever it was, it's gone." They all nodded, still a bit shaken, but feeling a lot safer knowing he was out there with a flashlight. That is until the screams started again. This time they were closer, too close. The man with the flashlight froze, his eyes wide with terror as a massive shape loomed into view. The creature stumbled closer, its eyes fixed on them with a burning intensity. It opened its mouth wide, letting out another ear-splitting scream, and lunged. The man screamed and dropped his flashlight as the creature pounced. He scrambled back, tripping over tree roots and rocks, desperately trying to get away. The creature was fast, though, faster than any animal he'd ever seen. It closed in on him, its hot, fetid breath on his neck. He could hear its heavy footsteps pounding the ground like a drum. He burst through the door and slammed it shut, fumbling with the latch, desperately trying to get it closed. He could hear the creature snarling and clawing at the other side, its rage echoing in the screams it let out. He could feel the vibrations of its anger through the wood beneath him. Finally, he managed to get the door closed and locked, sliding down against the wood, gasping for breath. His friends were staring at him, their faces pale with fear. "What? What was that?" one of them whispered, his voice shaking. The man looked up at the door, his eyes wide with terror. "I don't know," he whispered back, "but whatever it is, it's not human." They all huddled together, listening intently as the creature continued to scream and thrash against the door, its anger growing with each passing moment. But then suddenly, it stopped. They all stared at the door, their hearts pounding in their chests, unsure of what to do next. The silence was deafening. They could hear their own breathing, their own blood rushing in their ears. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the commotion outside the cabin started up again, this time even louder than before. They could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush, its heavy footsteps pounding the ground like thunder. They could almost feel its hot, fetid breath on their necks. The creature was coming back, and it was angrier than before. Whatever it wasn't giving up. The screams continued for what felt like hours, each one louder and more desperate than the last. They all huddled together, too afraid to move, too afraid to speak. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The only sound now was their own terrified breathing. They stayed like that for what felt like hours, not daring to move, not daring to speak. And then, just when they thought it was over, the door began to shake. They all screamed and huddled together as the creature outside the door began to claw and screech, trying to break down the flimsy wooden barrier between them. They could feel the vibrations of its rage through the wood beneath them. They could hear the splintering of the wood as the creature's claws tore into it. But no matter how hard it clawed, it couldn't break down the door. And eventually, its strength gave out and it collapsed on the other side, its screams reduced to whimpers. This creepy forest story comes from Reddit user I Cannot Be. I've cut out some parts for time's sake, but you can read the full story in the comments. So these two siblings were playing in the woods near their home. It was summer vacation and they were bored. There was a big tree in the backyard that was perfect for climbing, and while they were up there, they saw something weird. The light was shining through the branches in a way that created this archway made of sticks and vines. It almost looked like an old, gnarled hand was reaching out to grab them. But the weirdest part was that when the siblings touched it, it buzzed faintly. Like if you were to touch an electric wire, they decided to go check it out. And what was behind it? The girl stepped through first. She didn't want to go at first, but her brother convinced her to try. So she did. The moment she stepped through, though, the boy regretted that. The second that the girl's body broke the arch, it vanished. In its place was this buzzing ball of vines and sticks. The siblings were scared, so they ran home. The next day, though, the girl wanted to go back and find where her sister went. She figured maybe she just fell into a hole somewhere and that's why she couldn't be found. Their parents didn't want them going back there, but the girl went anyway. She told us that she didn't tell her parents because she knew they would have made her stay home after that, but she had to go. She needed to find her sister. When she got back to the arch, she noticed something weird. There were no footprints leading up to it, and it seemed to be buzzing louder than before. Then she saw something that made her scream and run away. It was her sister's shoes right next to the arch. She could hear her sister's shoes buzzing faintly, just like the arch. This wasn't right. If her sister fell into a hole, then how did her shoes land perfectly next to the arch? And why were they buzzing? The girl told her mother what happened, and that she found her sister's shoes. So her mother went with her back to the arch, except by this point, the arch was completely collapsed. There was just this pile of sticks and vines where the archway used to be. Her mother told her that it was probably just a figment of their imaginations, but I don't know about that. This reminds me of that story about the wishing portal. You should check that one out. But yeah, all this makes me wonder, is there anything behind our world that we can't see? Like, do other dimensions kind of connect to ours in random places? Because that seems to be the case in this story. Maybe there are other worlds that we can't see, but sometimes we catch glimpses of them. That or this story could be some sort of metaphor for addiction. Like the archway represents temptation. Once you break through it, everything changes. You're not the same ever again. That's kind of dark, though. I think this story could also be a warning about nature, like nature can be beautiful, but it can also be dangerous. Don't go messing around in the woods or you'll get lost forever. But that's just my opinion. What do you think? Let me know down in the comments below. Also, don't forget to subscribe and come back tomorrow for another creepypasta.